right. It is morning again in the Gulf of America. That's right. The long national nightmare of a body of water with the word Mexico in its name touching our sacred American soil has finally come to an end. And, you might be thinking, Ben, I don't give a shit what they call the Gulf of Mexico, in which case my response would be that that's a shame because renaming an ocean basin after America is literally the high point of what we can expect Trump to do in the next 4 years that will in any way, shape, or form benefit Americans. Otherwise, every indication from the last week since Trump has taken office again has been grim. Trump surrounded himself with the phalanx of tech billionaires at his inauguration. In the protective covering of some of the wealthiest men on the planet, he gave an inauguration speech where he didn't so much as mention all of the Americans who don't have health insurance or don't get paid enough to know that they're going to be able to, how they're going to be able to swing both rent and groceries next month. But he did find space for 2 whole paragraphs about how he was going to retake the Panama Canal from Panama. How exactly he was going to accomplish this, he didn't say. The United States signed a treaty to return the canal to Panamanian control in the 1970s, and the return was finalized at the end of the 90s. It's theirs. At this point, the only obvious way to take it back would be to actually send troops to reinvade Panama. Is Trump going to do that? I have no fucking idea. Neither do you. Neither does anybody else. We're just going to have to wait and see. Here's what I do know, though. If we do end up fighting a war to seize and annex Panamanian territory, none of the children of any of those tech billionaires who surrounded Trump at the inauguration are going to fight in that war. The people who come back in flag-draped coffins are going to be the children of the working class. Probably the high water mark of absurdity in that inauguration speech was Trump's promise, and this doesn't sound real, but I swear I'm not making this up, to plant the stars and stripes on Mars to spread our manifest destiny to that planet. And yes, he actually did use the exact phrase, spread our manifest destiny. It was kind of the perfect Trump era moment, the kind of thing that makes Matt McManus's phrase, postmodern conservatives, the perfect description of Trump era Republicans, because, okay, it's bizarre and deeply alarming to hear an American president using the phrase manifest destiny in the 3rd decade of the 21st century, but also how seriously can you take it when the immediate context where the sentence that he said it was about Mars? But I actually think this is a really revealing turn of phrase. I wrote an article about this for Unheard called Is Trump Just Another Hawk? My answer would be yes, but a slightly different way of getting to the same point I was making there would be this. We're going to be talking about Henry Kissinger a bit in the postgame. For patrons, we'll be chatting with the frontman of a post-punk band that has a song about Kissinger called Rest in Pissinger. But the reason I'm bringing Dr. K up now is that Kissinger's death a little over a year back was another one of these deeply revealing moments. Because you had all these Trumpy or certainly Trump-adjacent right-wing populist types in magazines like Compact and The American Conservative, or, for example, Sagar Enjeti. He did a debate with Crystal Ball and Breaking Points about this, saying, oh, Kissinger wasn't all bad. He was a realist, not a neocon. And they were saying that about, the butcher of Cambodia, the guy who passed on Nixon's famous instructions to the generals after his discussion with him. Anything that flies on anything that moves. The guy who said, I don't see why we should let Chile go communist just because its voters are irresponsible. And this is the guy they're saying, not so bad. At least he's not a neocon. He was a realist. That's a pretty good indication that a lot of these people's objections to the neocons didn't have a single goddamn thing to do with any kind of more basic opposition to waging imperialist wars in foreign countries that hadn't done anything to us. And in fact, I think if you listen closely to a lot of what these right-wing populist types say when they're attacking Bush-era neocons, they don't say that, the problem with the Iraq war was that it was a monstrous crime to cluster bomb, invade, and occupy a nation full of people who didn't want us there. They say that the problem is that it was a foolish attempt to spread freedom and democracy where it wasn't really going to work, and that it was against American interests. And that's actually more like a foreign policy version of the kind of conservative rhetoric that Albert Hirschman talks about in his book, The Rhetoric of Reaction. Hirschman breaks down the typical tropes of right-wing rhetoric in opposition to any kind of proposal for positive social reform, into what he calls the futility thesis, the perversity thesis, and so on. It won't do any good, or actually it's just going to make everything worse. Like they'll claim that raising the minimum wage will actually hurt the people it's supposed to help, because minimum wage hikes allegedly increase unemployment, even though, by the way, having brought up that example, I do feel the need to say first that there are a lot of empirical studies that undermine that claim. In fact, that's what I was talking about in that sample from the old debunk song from the Michael Brooks show, where I used the phrase data from a bunch of different countries. That's what I was talking about as a minimum wage study. And second, even if it does lead to a bit more unemployment, that's not a reason to let people continue to be paid poverty wages. Since most minimum wage workers will benefit from the hike and not lose their jobs. And if some people do lose their jobs, you can make up for that by creating new jobs in the public sector, like FDR's public works programs in the 1930s. But those are exactly the kinds of details that the reactionaries Hirschman is writing about don't engage with. Instead, they just kind of portray it as this like profound wisdom about human nature that, see, if you go around trying to fix everything, you'll just make a mess of it all. Better to just let it all be. And that's exactly the way these supposedly non-interventionist right-wing populist types talk about neocon foreign policy. You see, these misguided do-gooders are trying to spread freedom and democracy to these unenlightened savages. It won't work. You'll just make a mess of things. It doesn't serve American interests, which is exactly the opposite of a Chomskyite kind of left critique of the neocons. We always thought that Iraq was an exercise in aggressive American imperialism being justified by paper-thin, unconvincing appeals to freedom and democracy. Our objection was never that we didn't think Iraqis were capable of democracy. We would have celebrated if Saddam Hussein had been overthrown in a popular democratic revolution. It was that we didn't want American working class kids to have their lives thrown away, as indeed, one of the guys I went to high school had his life thrown away in that war, in an invasion that was ultimately being fought on behalf not of the Iraqis, but of the global dominance of the American empire. The good of the Iraqis would have been not cluster bombing, invading, and occupying the country against the will of the vast majority of the people who actually live there. And the reason for this whole digression on these two ways of criticizing the neocons is that when we see Trump openly talking about manifest destiny, when he spends 2 paragraphs, the inauguration speech, ranting about the need to retake the Panama Canal from the Panamanians, when he tries to pressure Denmark into selling America Greenland, which he's apparently been doing in the last week because he says we need it for national security reasons as a beachhead for opposing Russia and China. And he pointedly refuses to take military force off the table if economic pressure doesn't work. Is he serious about it? Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. I don't know how he could possibly be making it any clearer that the impression so many Americans have that Trump is a non-interventionist was always bullshit. And by the way, I blame Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party for aiding and abetting that impression by going around the country campaigning with Liz fucking Cheney and constantly bragging about being supported by Dick Cheney. We're being supported by everyone from Bernie Sanders to Dick Cheney. Remember that? And generally doing everything in her power to give voters the impression that out of the two of them, Trump was the candidate who was going to be less enthusiastic about American and military intervention around the world. But as he is making clear in every way that he possibly can right now, not just the absurd flourishes like spreading manifest destiny to Mars and making Canada the 51st state, but also doing things like signing an executive order to officially declare the Mexican drug cartels to be foreign terrorist organizations, which is a way of cracking open the door to, at least building a case for U.S. military intervention in Mexico, and saying that we need to take back the canal. We'd have to reinvade Panama to take. He's making it so goddamn clear that any objection that Trump world ever had to the neocons was not about non-interventionism. It was that he disliked the fact that they made a half-hearted effort to say that their wars had something to do with freedom and democracy, because he thinks freedom and democracy are for chumps, and that we should just aggressively pursue American interests with no pretense to any of that shit. If Greenland is strategically vital, we should just take it. If the Panama Canal Treaty was a bad deal, we should just reverse it. International law be damned. And certainly the will of the people who live in Greenland be damned. That's not non-interventionism. That's just moving away from the absurd, hypocritical, humanitarian imperialism of the neocon era to frank, unabashed 19th century style imperialism. And speaking of the 19th century, a magnificently revealing part of the inauguration speech was the couple of paragraphs that he spent praising the memory of William McKinley. He also talked about McKinley last year when he was on Rogan. He said he's becoming obsessed with McKinley. And it's amazing because for years and years, ever since Trump came down that fucking elevator, I've been hearing that he's a populist. I've been hearing that from people like Steve Bannon, who think it's a good thing. And I've also been hearing it from alarmed centrist libs who think it's a bad thing, right? The kind of people who think that Trump's right-wing populism and Bernie's left-wing populism are equally, dangerous. But I've been hearing it from all of them. They all agree on that much. And here we have Trump praising William McKinley. I wrote an article about this for MSNBC, and I just want to read you a few paragraphs from that article to make it clear why I say this is so magnificently absurd. So according to Thomas Frank's book, The People Know, the word populism was first coined on a train ride from Kansas City to Topeka in 1891. The group on the train was looking for a catchy word to describe the adherents of the political party they'd just founded. During its brief moment in the sun, the People's Party was one of the most effective third parties in American history. At its core, they were a movement of poor farmers being ground down by big banks and monopolistic firms, although they also worked to build bridges with urban workers, and they attracted support from labor union leaders like Eugene Debs, who would go on to become America's most prominent democratic socialist. According to Frank, the Kansans on that train in 1891 came up with the name in conversation with a local Democrat who knew some Latin. A populist was someone on the side of the populists, right? Latin for the people, against wealthy plutocrats. The original populists wanted to ease the financial burdens of small farmers by moving the United States off the gold standard, but they weren't by any means a single issue party. They advocated a whole raft of reforms, ranging from a shorter work week for the urban working class to public ownership of railroads to the direct election of senators. This was a broadly popular agenda. In the 1892 presidential election, the populists nominated James Weaver, a brigadier general in the Union Army in the Civil War, and he actually won 4 states, right? Colorado, Idaho, Kansas, and North Dakota. It was the only time a third party won even one state in decades, and it wouldn't happen again until Teddy Roosevelt's third-party bull moose run in 1912. In 1896, though, the Pops decided not to run a candidate of their own for 2 reasons. One is that the Democratic nominee, William Jennings Bryan, adopted important parts of the populist platform. The other is that the populists were terrified that if they didn't line up behind Bryan, they'd split the vote and throw the election to a man they deeply hated and regarded as an ultra-reactionary champion of big business and the big banks who were crushing them. Republican nominee, William McKinley. Bryan ended up running with the nominations of both the Democrats and the populists. Wealthy interests mobilized behind McKinley. Frank writes that pro-McKinley newspapers routinely fear-mongered about the Bryan campaign with comparisons to the French Revolution. Political cartoonists loved to depict populists as marching peasants wearing liberty caps. And the New York Sun called Bryan William Jacobin Bryan. In the end, McKinley won handily and the People's Party collapsed. McKinley presided over years of plutocrat-friendly policies at home, and warmongering abroad until he was assassinated by an anarchist factory worker in 1901. So Trump is telling us explicitly that William McKinley is the president he identifies with, the guy he sees himself in. And you know what? He's right. He's exactly right. We should take it seriously. And there's just one larger point I want to touch on here before I finish, which is how to think about Trump in terms of historical comparisons in general. I just finished comparing Trump to William McKinley. Elsewhere in an article I wrote after the election for Damage magazine, I compared him to Woodrow Wilson, who, remember, started the first Red Scare, deported Emma Goldman to Russia, threw Eugene Debs in prison for speaking out against World War I, and, oh yeah, invaded Mexico. Elsewhere in that article, I also compared him to Dwight D. Eisenhower, who we usually don't think of as a supervillain. I mean, as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, Eisenhower helped defeat the greatest villains of the 20th century in World War II. And on his way out of office, he said some nice stuff about the need to limit the military-industrial complex, which he built up for the last several years. But also, Eisenhower presided over the second Red Scare, some really scary repression of the left. And he did what Trump wants to do now, which is to use the U.S. military for mass deportation of migrants. In fact, since this was the 1950s, before shame had been invented, the actual official name of the operation, I swear to God, was Operation Wetback. And one reason for exploring these analogies is that we tend to analogize every awful reactionary figure to Hitler and Mussolini. Those were our go-to villains for obvious and good reasons. So those are the analogies that spring to mind. And then anyone saying, no, guys, this is hyperbole, is seen as, like, that's interpreted as saying, oh, don't be alarmed by Trump. Trump is fine. Maybe Trump isn't even worse than the Democrats. But I actually think Trump is a lot worse than the Democrats. I think it's a catastrophe that he's back in office. A catastrophe for which, by the way, I blame the Democrats for sucking and, running an awful campaign. And I think understanding all of the terrible and scary stuff that's happened in previous American history, how it was bad, it was awful, but we kept fighting and we got through it, can actually be really helpful in steering the right course between the twin dangers of minimizing the harm and potential dangers of a second Trump term on the one hand, and on the other hand, a really unproductive kind of doomerism. And I want to close this out by quoting one of the smartest commentators in American politics I can think of, Corey Robin, who just said something really smart about this in a social media post, right? So if you don't know Corey, he's a political theorist. He wrote a really good book called The Reactionary Mind. And here's what he said. Chalkbeat, which is one of the very best publications reporting on education, has an excellent piece today on how school leaders are fighting back against Trump. In Chicago, 2 officials from Homeland Security showed up at an elementary school. Thinking they were ICE and trained to refuse entry to any immigration official, the staff at the school refused to let them in. As it turns out, they were from the Secret Service, had nothing to do with immigration. In New York City, the mother of a student in middle school called the principal, saying she was too afraid to send her child to school. The principal told her to send the child to school, adding, ICE is going to have to arrest me before they arrest your daughter. He reassured her that he would lock her daughter in his office if he had to, just to protect her from ICE. The mother ended up sending her child to school. I want to stress these stories, and I encourage others to do the same, because the Republicans and some well-intentioned left critics of Republicans would have you believe that Trump is moving through political space like a knife through butter. I wrote my first book on fear, and one of the issues I focused on there, based in part on my own bitter personal experience, is how often it is that the most well-intentioned and concerned observer or bystander who provides the crucial and unintended aid to repressive power. Sterling Hayden, the actor who played the corrupt cop in The Godfather that Al Pacino kills, wrote an entire memoir about his struggles with McCarthyism in Hollywood. And one of the more unsavory aspects of that memoir involves a sympathetic therapist reinforcing the message of how powerful the Red Hunters were and how horrible it would be if you were blacklisted, merely bemoaning just how effective the repression is, how reality is so terrible and resistance is so absent, or so feudal, can become an amplifying instrument to power. Academics, journalists, progressives, and those who care about the unfortunate and the downtrodden are all too prone to supply this unintended service to power. Acting as a relay system for the right-wing bat signal, extending its range far beyond what it's actually capable of. And yeah, I have nothing to add to what Corey is saying there, except for circling and underlining his point, because I think he gets the balance just right. Trump, Elon Musk, Stephen Miller, these fuckers are genuinely and deeply evil. Again, Trump signed an executive order on his first day in office, also, by the way, Martin Luther King Day, to try to strip away American citizenship from millions of members of an ethnic minority group by ending birthright citizenship. That's depraved. But it's also a useful example because he probably won't be able to get it through the courts. And I think portraying it as if, our enemies were so strong that, they're going to be able to just, overturn democratic institutions entirely. We're just going to be living under full-on 1930s fascism. I think is an unhelpful exaggeration for many reasons, but one of them is what Corey Robin is talking about in that post. That these guys are the scum of the earth, but they're not all powerful. They can absolutely be politically defeated. And exaggerating our enemy's strength just does their work for them. So let's not do that. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.